In the thousands of years that stories have existed, whether it's portrayed by illustrations or words, a story has always been able to create ways of moving itself forward, whether it's through actions or dialogue. This is the same for most stories in the interactive medium, and although the dialogue stays the same, how actions are portrayed within the story are changed, as it's the player who's controlling the protagonist of the story, meaning that the game has to incentivize the player by giving them quests and objectives to move the plot along and give out exposition. Although this can help the player feel as if they are accomplishing things, it can also have the unfortunate effect of overwhelming them. It can have the player interested in the story, yet bored by the nature of the quests used to tell them, and this can lead to a problem. Of course, if you have an exceptional gameplay loop, like for instance Borderlands 2 or Skyrim, then it can carry the weight of the game, but it's extremely difficult to craft a satisfying gameplay loop. Of course, the writers can create interesting and varied quests with deep characters and a satisfying ending, but with games becoming bigger than ever, it's easy to see why so many are not successful in this endeavour. Although there is another way of creating exposition, and even though it perhaps may be unique, Sunless Exposition creates some of the most memorable stories we've seen in video games. But to really explain how that works, let's delve into Sunless Exposition, its gameplay loop and its Lovecraftian world. When you first boot up Sunless Sea, from its eerie music to its beautiful art style and the mystical stories that it tells, one can immediately see its roots in the Lovecraftian genre, whether it's the cosmic horror of insignificance, the suffocating cloud of tension created by the fear of the unknown, or the mixture of both to create memorable and horrific stories which are ingrained into the player's mind. It's the genre of Lovecraftian horror which drives each decision behind the design philosophy of the game. From the microscopic parts like the stories which Sunless Sea tells at each of its islands, to the macroscopic parts like the rather insignificant story or the randomized world. And there's the problem. Unlike many games, but like many Lovecraftian stories, Sunless Sea relies on the microscopic stories to create a larger macroscopic tone, making the smaller stories the main attraction rather than the larger stories and the choices you make within it. But this means that the smaller stories that you encounter on your travels need not only quality writing, but also a brilliant use of exposition. Within many video games, quests or objectives are used to tell its story, and within most they have the same structure, with action and dialogue or perhaps a mixture of both. Quests are a brilliant and effective way of creating exposition, which is why it's so interesting when a game uses a different way of telling their stories. And out of those which go off the beaten path, Sunless Seas is one of the few which creates captivating stories. So to conclude, let's talk about its use of the brilliant and imaginative lamplight mechanic. As we just stated, in most games the exposition loop consists of dialogue and action, whereas in Sunless Sea it consists of dialogue, wait, and then repeat. It sounds so mind-numbingly boring that one could ask quite reasonably why we've been building up to this mechanic, but in practice it creates brilliant, complex and interesting stories due to its tense and consistent atmosphere, not interrupted by mindless tasks given to the player. But it also creates a flaw. How does Sunless Sea fit its gameplay within this loop? It answers this question with the aforementioned lamplight mechanic. It signifies the so-called wait part of the loop. It may sound dull, but in truth it's a return to Sunless Sea's gameplay loop. Explore, fail, and then succeed. It helps push the player into finding more stories. But this means that the game has to draw you back to the original story that it was telling you, so, when it is needed, in the bottom left, the lamplight turns on, signifying that the story has progressed while also creating a feeling of a realistic world where time passes while you are elsewhere. To summarise, the exposition system with its interesting lamplight mechanic is a strange way of telling stories, which on paper looks like a terrible and shallow idea, but in practice, although it needs gripping writing, which Sunless has in abundance, it creates a fantastic foundation with memorable and deep stories with a plethora of choices and interesting characters, all of which makes Sunless a fantastic RPG which is home to an eerily beautiful Lovecraftian world.